In this exciting episode, Perry goes to Camp Grace, but there's no grace to be found for an accused murderer. It's Season 2, Episode 4 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Sardonic Sergeant. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia, as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler, where just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each episode in the law library, we return to prior cases to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. Every good law library requires a good note-taker, and today we talk about Della, Perry's professional note-taker. A weird thing happens when Major Lessing visits Perry's office.
If you don't mind, I'd prefer not to have any notes taken of this meeting for the records. Della?
That's right. Lessing doesn't want there to be notes, and Perry complies. This flies in the face of a Perry precedent: demand notes, especially when someone objects to having them taken. See, for instance, the case of the empty tin.
Get her out of here. I don't want any notes taken. I don't want any blackmail.
I'll go along with you, Della. Getting a little warm in here for me also.
Or, my personal favorite, when Perry is paid a visit by Arthur Jarrick in the case of the Screaming Woman.
I thought I'd drop by for a little chat. Private chat.
The street always sits in on my conferences,
I'd prefer no witnesses.
which only increases my desire to have one.
So, this visit to the law library ends with a question. Why does Perry let the discussion with Major Lessing happen off the record? Because he knows Lessing is innocent? Because it's a matter of national security? Because he's secretly tape recording the entire conversation and doesn't need Della's notes? What a can of worms. Let's see if a pattern emerges as the show goes on that answers this vexing question. Now, without further ado, let's get to the plot of our episode. The Case of the Sardonic Sergeant. It sounds like a setup for a joke. How many military men does it take to burn $10 million in Corregidor? The answer, 8. 7 to burn and 1 to steal 400,000 of it. Okay, it's not that funny. All the officers at Camp Grace in good old California should know, because that's where the culprit is.
Well, does the Treasury Department know how much was stolen? Well, judging by the serial numbers, I'd say around $400,000.
All of it isn't in circulation. But every bill that's shown up has been traced directly to this post. There were 8 men detailed to dispose of that money. 6 of those men are dead. Of the 2 remaining, one is a man named Tony Cusick, wanted for desertion. The other is Major Frank Lessing.
Our finance officer?
It looks like Major Frank Lessing is guilty of the crime. His clerk, Sergeant Dexter, certainly suspects him.
And I felt sure you wouldn't want me to open the safe for them. You'd better explain that remark, Sergeant. Well, I took the liberty of opening the safe before they got here. You what? When I picked up the payroll money at the bank this morning, the bank gave me a list of the serial numbers.
Go on.
Those aren't the same bills I turn over to you, sir. The numbers don't match.
Then there's the cryptic things Frank Lessing says to his wife before he leaves her.
Helen, do me a favor, will you?
Of course.
Always remember that I love you.
And then there's the fact that he goes to Perry in the night, Nicodemus-like, as though he needs a lawyer.
I have a wonderful wife and 2 lovely daughters. We've been very happy. What I intend to do tomorrow will destroy that happiness.
Does this sound like a guilty man to you? Well, then there's the suicide note.
My dearest Helen, I'm sorry that this is the way it must end. There's nothing else I can do. For some time now, I've used my office to dispose of more than $85,000, which I stole from the army at Corregidor. Kiss the children for me, and try not to judge me too harshly.
But it wasn't suicide. It was murder, and Lessing died because he found the Corregidor thief. Who are the suspects? Well, we've got Sergeant Dexter, who Perry defends.
Who wrote that note?
Sergeant Dexter. Your husband didn't commit suicide, Mrs. Lessing. The only mistake he made was trying to protect the man who eventually murdered him.
Then there's the clerk, Walter Haskell, who has a connection to the Philippines, his illegitimate daughter, Ricky Stevens.
Walter Haskell? Haskell is head cashier, and he is also involved with a chick young enough to be his daughter. Her name's Ricky Stevens, but don't let the name fool you. Her father's name might have been Stevens, but her mother must have been an Oriental.
Just a bit of a cul-de-sac here, but the one scene that focuses on Ricky Stevens where she says lines is a showstopper. It's in a bar, it features Paul, and the one-liners keep coming.
What's the matter?
Your voice. You just hit a flat note.
Never mind. I said this was on me. Keep your money.
Thanks, but no thanks. I only take gifts from friends. That should cover it. Keep the change.
She only takes gifts from friends. You must be the only enemy she has.
She's not a suspect. Wally Haskell didn't do it either. That leaves Lessing's brother-in-law, civilian Howard Evans, who looks a lot like New York Times columnist Ross Douthat.
I knew the disgrace would ruin his wife and children.
Couldn't Major Lessing have intended to engage my services to defend you because you switched that money? And isn't that what he meant when he said it would ruin the lives of his family because you were Mrs. Lessing's brother?
Well, Evans certainly helped introduce the stolen cash into circulation, but it was Tony Cusick, a.k.a. Willie Smith, who committed the crime, and Perry breaks him down on the stand.
I tell you, you've got this all wrong. Show me where, Cusick. You planned to have Major Lessing's death look like suicide. But when Mrs. Lessing destroyed that note and told her brother about it, you had to improvise. You realized it would look like murder and you had to have a fall guy. That's why you planted that $10,000 in Sergeant Dexter's footlocker. The records indicate that it must have been you who typed that phony suicide note.
You're wrong. I don't even know how to type.
You mean Sergeant Smith didn't know how to type? But what was your job while you were in the service still using the name Cusick? I'll tell you what it was. You were a clerk typist.
Meanwhile, Paul ends the entire affair with a hot date. Simmer down, P.I.
Don't worry. It isn't Corregidor money. Put a cigarette down in my money clip this morning. So I figured it was just the thing to spend on a hot date.
Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. Adela is something about a particular actor or actress who appeared in the episode. And a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul for this episode concerns Corregidor Island in Manila Bay. You might know that it was the site of a 1942 battle between the U.S. and Japan, with Japan emerging victorious. Our Paul prompt, then. Was there any money burning during the U.S. surrender? In fact, has there ever been 10 million, 5 million, $5.50 burned as a result of a military defeat in U.S. history? Was this show's idea ripped from the headlines? Our Della this week concerns Barbara Luna, aka Ricky Stevens.
I'd like to rearrange your vocal cords anyway. They're off key.
You tell him, Ricky. Though she was born in Manhattan, Barbara Luna had a Hungarian mother whose dad was from Italy, and a Filipino father whose mother was from Spain. She was cast throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s in a hodgepodge of non-Caucasian roles. She got her start on Broadway as part of the South Pacific and King and I casts, moved on to television, starred in Bonanza, Hawaii Five-0, Zorro, Outer Limits, and yes, even as a alien in Star Trek, the original series. In film, there was a role opposite Frank Sinatra, and she was the prison queen bee in 1982's The Concrete Jungle. She was married for a couple years in the early 60s to Western star Doug McClure, aka the Virginian. And she's still alive and kicking at 81 years old. Our Perry this episode involves our intrepid hero's service history. Here's what he tells Sergeant Dexter.
When I was in the service, they used to say never volunteer. But if you'd like me to represent you.
Did Perry heed this advice any better when he was in the service? If he didn't, was volunteering worth it? It was in this case, so good for him. The theme for this episode is treachery. Though the episode is not particularly political, note that there's not even one mention of communism. The episode does center around patriotic and familial betrayal. Past crimes never simply disappear. Their repercussions are felt even years later. Walter Haskell has to admit to his sexual indiscretion, although, by the way, he must have fathered Ricky in World War I guess, because of her age. I'm not really sure. And Lessing fears betraying his wife by implicating his own civilian brother-in-law, who's Willie Smith's partner. Perry, as always, is able to sniff out the traitor. It's somehow fitting that the chief crime is a kind of counterfeiting, introducing currency into circulation that should have been burned. The patriotism, faux patriotism of Tony Cusick, and the family life, faux family life, of Howard Evans and Walter Haskell look good on the surface, but underneath lies deceit and lies. You know, it's almost enough to make any sergeant sardonic. Now it's time for a Perry proverb. Just like in the case of the corresponding corpse, Perry gets dragged into a case by a man who ends up dead. After agreeing to look into Major Lessing's case, Perry gives Della and future lawyers everywhere this rule of thumb.
When a finance officer leaves $1,500 on my desk and doesn't ask for a receipt, it's serious.
I'll see that your car is ready.
Let that be a lesson to all you lawyers and would-be clients. Always demand a receipt and get a receipt. Otherwise, it'll be clear that your brother-in-law is probably absconding with should-have-been-burnt loot. You know, figuratively. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
You know, there is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Our research prompt from the case of the pint-sized client involved safe cracking. Is using a stethoscope a thing? The answer is yep. Old bank vaults had shoddily made tumblers that would more audibly click when the dial was manipulated. You would need something like a stethoscope to hear it, but they would click, and this would more readily yield the safe's combination numbers. But with the improvement in safe and vault manufacturing and technology, it became harder to hear the clicks and thus a less frequent means of accessing bank vaults. That being said, Perry's representation of safe cracking is totally indebted to TV tropes, much more than it is real-life robbery. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this episode that you'd like to comment on or correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. All Perry Pod episodes are available via Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes. Thanks so much for joining me on this pod journey. Join us next time as Perry tries to make true love last. I've got my doubts. It's the case of the curious bride. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat!